In the first video in this series, we showed books and other materials U.S. schools are using to teach children about sex and gender identity. In this video, we explain in detail how what is being taught is scientifically inaccurate and how it undermines critical thinking skills. We need to start by talking about what sex is and what it isn't. Sex, as in males and females, has everything to do with, well, sex, as in how we human beings reproduce ourselves.
Like every other mammal on Earth, human beings have two sexes, male and female. Human females are born with ovaries, which, when functional, produce eggs. Human males are born with testicles, which, when functional, produce sperm. Eggs and sperm are known as gametes. The fusion of an egg with a sperm creates a new human being. This process allows the human species to survive. The testicles and the ovaries are known as gonads. They are the primary sex organs. Women are adult human females. Men are adult human males. Girls and boys are female and male human children.
While the primary sex organs determine one's sex, various secondary sex organs are almost always present alongside them. In addition to ovaries, the primary female sex organ, most females have a vagina, a uterus, and fallopian tubes. Together, these organs enable women to carry out the female function of gestating and delivering a baby.
In addition to testicles, the primary male sex organ, most males have secondary sex organs, including the penis, epididymis, vas deferens, and accessory sex glands.
Female humans typically have two X chromosomes, and males typically have one X and one Y. For this reason, chromosomes are often used as a surrogate for sex identification. These chromosomes carry the instructions that direct development down one of two sexualized paths, leading to the development of either female or male gonads. Hormones produced by the gonads are part of the sequence of development each person undergoes. But it is the gonads that determine a person's sex. It's not chromosomes, hormones, or secondary sex organs. As the result of the physical shape and size of our sex organs and the hormones associated with each sex, women and men have countless sex-influenced characteristics. To accommodate female reproductive organs, for instance, females have longer torsos and wider pelvises than males. The slant of a female's thigh bones is different than that of a male. Presented with a skeleton, experts can determine sex with 95% accuracy simply by measuring the hip bones. Here are just some of the major differences between male and female bodies. Pause the video if you'd like to study these, or go to source documents via the links in the description.
Some claim that sex is a spectrum. That claim is nonsense. It generally appears in popular magazines, not in peer-reviewed scientific papers. Sex is defined by gametes, eggs and sperm, and the gonads, ovaries and testes, associated with producing those. There are only two types of gonads, each of which produces only one of two possible gametes. There is no way to produce the next generation beyond the pairing of the two sexes, male and female, the former contributing sperm, latter eggs. Therefore, there is no third sex, let alone a spectrum of additional sexes.
A quantitative difference is a difference in degree, like the contrast between a large and a small lump of coal. A qualitative difference is a difference in kind, like the contrast between a lump of coal and a diamond. Within each sex, things like the size, shape, color, and functionality of sexual anatomy do exist on a spectrum. These are quantitative differences within each sex. But sex itself is a qualitative, not a quantitative difference. One is either male or female. There aren't degrees of maleness or femaleness. A man with a small penis isn't less male than one with a large penis. Small-breasted women are every bit as female as large-breasted ones. Similarly, some women are taller, faster, or stronger than other women. Some have deeper voices. None of these things make them more or less female. None conveys to them some degree of maleness. Some men are shorter, slower, and weaker than other men. Some have higher-pitched voices. None of these things place them on a spectrum regarding their sex. For many physical characteristics, there is overlap between the sexes. With respect to height, for example, some women are taller than some men. The tallest man, however, is taller than the tallest woman, and the average height for males is considerably greater than the average height for females. For some attributes, such as height, the overlap between males and females is significant, but often there is very little overlap. For example, the strongest 10% of women in hand grip strength are weaker than 90% of men. Top female athletes who work hard to maximize their grip strength are only as strong as average to weak men.
What about intersex conditions? The term intersex is confusing and outdated because it implies that some people exist on a spectrum between male and female, which is not the case. The preferred term is DSD, which stands for Disorders of Sexual Development. DSDs do not involve additional sexes, and the great majority of the time there's no doubt as to the sex of the person with a DSD. An estimated 1.7% of live births involve DSDs, which is roughly the same percentage as that of people born globally with red hair. But 88% of all DSDs, 1.5% of live births, involve late-onset congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a condition in which a person has all the primary and secondary organs for their sex, but later in life an adrenal gland disorder causes health problems. People with this condition are unambiguously male or female. What about the other 0.2% of births with DSDs after we subtract out the hyperplasia cases? Most of those other DSDs also leave no doubt whatsoever as to a person's sex. People with Klinefelter Syndrome, for example, are clearly male. With XXY chromosomes, they have small testicles and produce less testosterone than normal, but they are definitely male. People with vaginal agenesis are clearly female. They have normal ovaries, but the distal third of the vagina doesn't develop properly and is replaced with fibrous tissues.
Of the 40 or so DSDs, only a tiny handful, less than 0.02% of live births, involve any ambiguity as to the sex of the individual. Even in those cases, the ambiguity often falls away upon examination. A male with a small or malformed penis or undescended testicles may resemble a female at first glance, but further examination makes clear that the baby is a boy. Similarly, a large clitoris on a girl may resemble a penis at first glance, but closer examination reveals that it isn't one. In a very small number of cases, people are born with genitals that have characteristics of both sexes or otherwise don't match their gonads. One DSD expert estimates that this occurs in less than 0.001% of live births. There are also a very small number of babies who have tissue from both ovaries and testicles in their bodies. This happens in approximately 0.001% of live births. In these cases, one set of tissues is usually dominant. There are no known cases of human hermaphrodites, that is, people capable of producing both sperm and eggs, and none of the individuals with tissue from both gonads represent a third sex. In other words, it is scientifically false to use DSDs to claim that sex is a spectrum, because DSDs don't create additional sexes, and each person with a DSD is either male or female based on the gonad definition of sex. But even if we were to falsely claim that some babies are outside of the male-female dichotomy, the incidence would be so rare that it would be absurd to describe it as constituting a spectrum. It should also be noted that many DSD activists strongly oppose DSDs being classified as a third sex. They've been fighting to be seen as the men and women they are. And the phrase sex assigned at birth is a term of art that originated in the realm of DSDs for very limited situations where doctors did assign sex without regard to a child's actual sex. Use of that phrase is inaccurate and entirely inappropriate for most births.
There's something else very important about DSDs that you need to know. DSDs have virtually nothing to do with transgenderism. Almost none of the people claiming transgender or non-binary identities have DSDs. Trans women, that is, men who say they are women, almost never have DSDs. They have standard male physiology inside and out. Likewise, trans men, or women who say they are men, almost never have DSDs. They have standard female physiology inside and out. By and large, trans-identifying people do not have intersex conditions, nor do they have the challenges that go along with those conditions. Moreover, most people with DSDs do not identify as trans or non-binary. The truth is that the vast majority of people with intersex conditions identify as male or female rather than transgender or transsexual. Thus, where all people who identify as transgender or transsexual experience problems with their gender identity, only a small portion of intersex people experience these problems. Some suggest that there might be an as-yet undiscovered DSD that trans-identifying people have, whereby some key portion of their brains is like what one finds in the opposite sex. In short, that they have a male brain trapped in a female body, or vice versa. They point to various studies like this one. It looked at the stria terminalis in the central part of the hypothalamus, referred to as BSTC, and concluded that a female-sized BSTC was found in male-to-female transsexuals. This sounds significant until you look at the details of the study. The brains of a total of 6 deceased transsexuals were compared to those of 36 deceased individuals who, it was believed, did not identify as trans. The sample size is way too small to draw any firm conclusions. Low sample size and failure to adequately consider other factors like sexual orientation of study participants and cross-sex hormone use are common limitations in transgender brain research. These and other confounding factors can greatly affect the brains being researched and observed.
But more importantly, look at this chart from the study just mentioned, showing BSTC volumes for the various brains examined. These were the BSTC volumes for the trans-identifying men's brains. Notice that some men who didn't identify as trans had lower volumes than some of the trans identifiers, volumes in the female range. And some women had BSTC volumes in the middle of the male range. In this and other studies, when people declare that trans-identifying male brains match female brains, what they really mean is that they're in the same range as women. But the same can be said for the brains of some men who don't identify as trans. In fact, there are no universal male-female differences in structures or circuits across the human species. There is no male brain and female brain. A recent comprehensive review of 3 decades of MRI and post-mortem brain data concluded that few supposed male-female differences turn out to be real when the larger average size of male brains is taken into account. Overall, male-female brain differences appear trivial and population-specific. The human brain is not sexually dimorphic, the review concluded. Even if studies could demonstrate that trans-identifying people had brain features typical of the opposite sex, this would not establish that their brains caused their transgender identities. The human brain is highly plastic, meaning that the things we do and experience shape our brains. For example, taxicab drivers famously have larger than average memory centers in their brains as the result of their work. Moreover, even if a brain structure did exist that put so-called female thoughts and feelings into the brain of a man or vice versa, Even if the brain could somehow make a person feel like they were the opposite sex, each person's sex would still be determined by their reproductive anatomy, their primary sex organs, not by their brain, eyes, feet, or any other body parts.
A trans-identifying person can attempt to resemble the opposite sex, but they can't become the opposite sex. For humans and all other mammals, sex is immutable. It is baked into us from the earliest stages of prenatal development. It is reflected in each cell of our bodies. Believing oneself to be the other sex doesn't make it so, nor does chemical or surgical alteration of one's body. Surgically created genitals do not function like real genitals, nor do they even look like them if scrutinized at all. A faux vagina is a surgically created hole that will shorten and close unless a person uses a dilator regularly to prevent it. A faux penis can only become erect through the use of a mechanical device. In summary, sex is real, it's binary, and it's immutable. For documentation of all of this, see the links in the description. See in particular the Project NETI statement, signed by over 100 biologists, doctors, and other scientists from around the world. Sex also matters.
It matters medically. Symptoms, diagnoses, appropriate treatments, appropriate medications and dosages, and more are all affected by which sex a person is. If a trans-identifying person fails to tell the doctor his or her actual sex, they may risk serious health consequences. Sex matters socially. We need to know how many females and males there are in order to provide adequate facilities, products, educational programs, and services for each. Sex matters in terms of civil and human rights. On the basis of sex, girls and women have long been subjected to violence, low wages, and glass ceilings. We have been told we must meet impossible, demeaning standards of beauty. We have fought for and won vital sex-based rights. On the basis of sex, boys and men experience their own kind of cultural straitjacket. They are told not to cry, not to pursue certain careers, not to wear pink frilly things, and the like. To end sex-based discrimination, we must recognize that it exists, and we must organize to fight it as women and men. To detect and analyze sex discrimination, we must gather sex-based data.
Sex also matters in competitive sports. Without sex-segregated sports, only men would be able to pursue athletic careers, win trophies, and set records in most sports. Physiological differences that give males substantial advantage over women range from the heart's capacity to get more oxygen, to the percentage of fast-twitch fibers in muscles, to the angle of the thigh bone, which delivers speed to male runners. Natural testosterone levels enhance male performance, but reducing testosterone after puberty does not substantially reduce male advantage. A combination of factors produce that advantage. The data on actual sport performance drives home the need for female-only sports. In sport after sport, top female athletes in their prime can be beaten by hundreds or even thousands of male athletes, including high school boys who are far from their prime and older male athletes who are well past theirs. Where males have been allowed to compete in women's sports, they have captured titles and set all-time so-called female records. Here we see a male taking a gold in women's weightlifting at the Pacific Games in 2019. Without a separate women's category, few, if any, women would qualify to run in the Boston Marathon. Sports statistics are crystal clear regarding the need for sex segregation in sports. Sex matters in so many ways, and we need words to talk about all of this. The words we have are male, female, man, woman, boy, girl, he, and she. In summary, sex is real, binary, immutable, and important. But now, let's revisit what the schools are teaching about sex.
Children are being denied basic information on biology. They are being taught things that are blatantly scientifically inaccurate. Let's look at the wrong answers schools give to 7 basic questions.
1. Does sex have something to do with anatomy? Schools teach children that a person's sex has nothing to do with their reproductive anatomy. A male person who believes himself to be female is female by virtue of that belief. A female person who believes she's male is male, regardless of the biological reality of her body. This false message is being delivered loud and clear from kindergarten onward. 2. Is sex arbitrarily assigned at birth? School children are taught that doctors guess and assign the sex of newborns. This is inaccurate. To guess is to form an opinion from little or no evidence. In reality, doctors observe and record a newborn's sex based on sound scientific data, and their observations are accurate more than 99% of the time. Yes, errors can occur when, due to birth defects, genitalia do not match gonadal sex. These fringe cases, the rarest disorders of sexual development, are seized upon by ideologues and curriculum designers to obfuscate biological reality. Remember, the vast majority of transgender people do not have DSDs, and most people with DSDs do not identify as transgender. In fact, the intersection between the two categories is vanishingly small.
3. What is the anatomical basis of sex? Most school materials fail to explain the anatomical basis for sex determination. When they do address this topic, they get it wrong. According to the Human Rights Campaign, a resource children are directed to, sex is based on chromosomes and genitals. That's wrong. Chromosomes and genitals are highly accurate surrogates for sex determination, but the gonads are what counts. 4. Do DSDs represent a third sex? Schools consistently use the term intersex instead of DSDs, and they provide children with inaccurate definitions. The elementary school book, It Feels Good to Be Yourself, asserts that intersex means that from birth, someone's body doesn't match exactly what we have defined as male or female. This is wrong. The bodies of those with DSDs do match exactly the medical and biological definitions of the two sexes. The Trevor Project, a resource to which children are referred, says that many intersex people are given a sex of male or female at birth, even if they fall somewhere in the middle. This ignores basic biology and the pleas of people with DSDs to not be labeled as something other than male or female. When specific examples of intersex conditions are given by school-linked materials, they are invariably the rarest conditions, those involving some ambiguity as to sex, conditions present in 0.001% of live births. The schools do not explain that these conditions are extremely rare. The Gender Unicorn, a resource schools share with families, declares, "We know that around 2% of babies are born intersex. That is about the same percentage as natural-born redheads." So children are led to believe that there are vast numbers of people for whom their biological sex is difficult to determine. In short, the nature and prevalence of DSDs is grossly misrepresented in materials used by the schools. 5. Is sex a spectrum? Having misrepresented DSDs as third sexes and inflated children's perceptions as to their prevalence, schools teach children that sex exists on a spectrum for all people, not just those with DSDs. Some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are both, neither, or somewhere in between, explains the book It Feels Good to Be Yourself. Schools teach that sex determination is a quantitative matter, not a qualitative one. They teach that there are degrees of maleness and femaleness. This is 180 degrees from the truth. Human sex is not a spectrum. There are exactly two sexes, and every person from the moment of conception is immutably one or the other. The gender-bred person illustrates the mindset into which children are being inculcated. People can use this tool to assess their so-called womanness and manness as part of determining their gender identity, and to assess their so-called femaleness and maleness as part of determining their anatomical sex. Note that the list of things to consider related to maleness and femaleness includes secondary sex organs and characteristics like body hair and voice pitch, but it fails to mention what actually determines sex, whether you were born with testicles or ovaries. Women who are hairy are encouraged to see themselves as more male than less hairy women. Men with higher voices are encouraged to consider themselves more female than other men. This unscientific approach confounds the fundamental basis of biological sex determination with the overlapping ranges of characteristics typically associated with each sex. Teaching children that sex is a spectrum and that there are degrees of maleness and femaleness is not only scientifically inaccurate, it's also psychologically harmful. It can undermine children's self-esteem during puberty when self-consciousness about one's body and how it measures up is common. Resources like these that children find online are full of other inaccuracies, mired in the false understanding that sex is a spectrum. One popular guide to gender claims that, quote, a clitoris is a short penis, or a penis is a long clitoris, unquote, completely misrepresenting distinctly different organs with fundamentally different functions. Children are primed by our schools to believe blatant falsehoods like these.
6. Can a person be born in the wrong body? The concept of a male brain trapped in a female body, or vice versa, is not supported by evidence, nor does the concept make any sense if one examines it for more than a moment. Referring to brains as male or female is itself highly controversial. As noted earlier, respected scientists have published studies like this one, a comprehensive review of the human brain which documents that there are few male-female differences in the brain beyond size. Nonetheless, the schools read books like I Am Jazz to school children. This book and others school materials teach them that there are girl and boy brains, and that somehow the brain of one can end up in the body of the other. 7. Is there a scientific basis for sex-segregated sports? Many schools now put any boy who claims to be female onto girls' sports teams. This disregards a mountain of evidence that it's unfair to girls to do so. Males in general are faster and stronger than females. With the passage of Title IX in 1972, girls won the right to equal treatment in sports to account for the physical differences between sexes and to give girls a fair playing field on which to compete. With school support for gender self-ID, the rights of girls and women are being rolled back 50 years. Here we see two trans-identifying males in Connecticut competing in a female race, leaving the girls behind in the dust. Children are taught that sex isn't a rational basis for segregating sports, despite volumes of evidence that it is. They are taught that gender self-identity is a rational basis for segregating sports, even though segregating sports based on self-ID wipes out decades of gains for women's rights. If a student says, boys are better at sports than girls, teachers are armed by the schools with a trite response about how some girls are better than some boys, and so on. The answer teachers are encouraged to give doesn't mention the scientific reality of male physiological advantage. It doesn't mention the huge volumes of sports performance data which establish beyond doubt absolute male dominance in competitive sports. It only links children to websites that declare men in women's sports to be a great thing. The same dynamic applies to other sex-segregated rights, such as the right to sex-segregated spaces. The schools present it as obvious that males who claim to be females have a right to be in female spaces, with no regard for the right to privacy and safety women fought for so many years. On question after question regarding sex and basic biology, the schools are delivering scientifically and medically inaccurate information. Driving this miseducation is the wholehearted embrace of gender identity ideology by the schools. This ideology is riddled with irrationality, inconsistency, and anti-scientific sophistry.
Schools teach children that gender identities must be affirmed and that everyone has one. So what is gender identity? Children are taught that gender identity is how a person identifies their gender, one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of these, both, or another gender. A person's internal, deeply felt sense of being either man, woman, boy, or girl, or another gender. a person's identity as a boy, a girl, both, or neither. Okay, so we know that gender identity is about identifying as a gender, and we have some examples of gender, boy, girl, etc. But what exactly is gender? It's important to know the meaning of that key word. But the materials provided by the schools fail to provide a clear definition. With effort, we eventually find 2 attempts. The Trevor Project says that gender describes our internal understanding and experience of our own gender identity. The 3rd grade lesson plan accompanying the book Is That for a Boy or a Girl says gender is a person's feeling about being either boy or girl or another gender. Both of these definitions are circular. They include the word gender. Moreover, these definitions are virtually indistinguishable from those supplied for gender identity. Here are the definitions offered in that 3rd grade lesson plan, side by side. Gender identity is a person's internal, deeply felt sense of being either man, woman, boy or girl, or another gender. Gender is a person's feeling about being either boy or girl or another gender. So, gender identity is a feeling about gender, which is a feeling about gender. The failure to define the most fundamental element of gender identity ideology, the word gender, should raise red flags for anyone supporting rational, fact-based education for our children. While gender is never actually meaningfully defined, we do get clues as to its meaning via the examples of gender that are provided: boy, girl, man, woman, male, female. Notice that these words are the very same words used for the sexes people can be. It's reasonable to conclude, therefore, gender is a synonym for sex. In fact, schools and gender organizations repeatedly use the terms sex and gender interchangeably. But no, various gender identity groups protest. Even though they will never define gender for you in any meaningful, non-circular way, they insist that sex and gender are 2 different things. Regardless of their shifting definitions, one thing is clear. The concept of gender identity is being used to attack the biological reality of sex and to eviscerate the meaning of the words we need to discuss it.
According to gender ideology, the sex observed for someone at birth is a mere placeholder until that person settles on and proclaims their true gender identity. At that point, if the person doesn't identify with their biological sex, well, then the doctors and other adults at the birth are declared to have been wrong. Oops, Ruthie was a girl all along, the book It Feels Good to Be Yourself tells children. This despite Ruthie's male anatomy. According to gender ideology, a person really is the sex they proclaim themselves to be, physical reality notwithstanding. Males who believe themselves to be female, also known as trans women, really are female in the gender identity world. As such, they can change and shower in women's locker rooms, capture women-only positions and awards, share women's shelters with female rape victims, and participate in women's sports. Under gender ideology, this man, who identifies as a woman, occupies a spot reserved for a woman in the New York Democratic Party district leadership. Using science-based definitions, a person is female if she was born with female gonads. A person is male if he was born with male gonads. Women are adult human females, men are adult human males, and girls and boys are female and male human children. These are definitions that are objective, rational, stable, verifiable, and rooted in material reality. Under gender identity, instead of science-based definitions, female means anyone who says they're female. Male means anyone who says they're male. Other terms like man, woman, boy, and girl are similarly unhinged. Instead of sex being defined by the physical reality of people's bodies, it is determined by what people believe themselves to be. Under gender ideology, the meaning of words has become unmoored from reality. The word woman used to mean someone with female reproductive anatomy. Now it can refer to males who identify as females, like Alex Drummond, shown here. And Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner, shown here, winning Olympic gold in men's track, and with 2 of the 6 children he fathered. Under gender ideology's definitions, the term man can refer to a biological male or a biological female who identifies as male.
The meaning of key words can even vary over time. There are individuals who believe they're a woman one day and a man the next. The definitions of words are so altered by gender ideology that they encompass the opposite of what they actually mean. The category of women now includes men, and vice versa. Gender ideology renders biological and sex-linked terminology meaningless. Sex organs lose any semblance of stable definition under gender ideology. Testicles, penises, ovaries, and vaginas are considered male or female organs depending on the feelings of the individual involved. Even quintessential biological functions are no longer classified as uniquely male or female. Women who have given birth but identify as male insist that men can gestate and give birth. These women call themselves fathers, despite having provided the egg, gestated the baby, and gone through labor. All of this is irrational and unscientific. To have a rational, fact-based discussion requires words with stable definitions. Gender identity ideology replaces objective, clear, verifiable, consistent definitions with ones that are subjective, unclear, unverifiable, and inconsistent. Why should we abandon concrete definitions of female, male, woman, man, uterus, penis, father, mother, etc.? Definitions that allow us to discuss, study, learn about, plan for, and celebrate the physical realities of human bodies. Why should we replace those concrete definitions with subjective definitions that shift from person to person and day to day, rendering the words meaningless? This anti-science madness has no place in school curriculum. The whole premise of this new subjective lexicon is the notion that a man or woman can know what it feels like to be the opposite sex. Trans-identifying people say they feel like the opposite sex. This is absurd. People are incapable of having feelings derived from anatomy they don't possess. How can any man know what a woman feels like? How can any woman feel like a man? Empaths and mind melds exist on Star Trek, not in real life. Schools should teach science, not science fiction.
And why does it make sense to accept as valid a person's self-perception as the opposite sex while contradicting an anorexic self-perception that they are overweight? Should we embrace as reality the feelings of those with body integrity disorder who erroneously believe they're missing limbs? Why, in particular, should we accept as real the perceptions of children regarding their sex? Children are still learning. They can make big mistakes and have many misperceptions. Adults have an important role to play in teaching children and protecting them from harm. For small children, the line between reality and make-believe is blurry. With respect to sex in particular, studies document that given a doll in stereotypically male clothing, children consider the doll to be a boy. When, in front of the child, the same doll is switched to stereotypically female clothing, the child believes it to be a girl. It takes a while for children to develop sex constancy, the understanding that sex remains the same even if costumes change.
Steeped in gender ideology, some adults steer children towards trans identities. The extent to which some people, including professionals, will go to see signs of transgenderism in small children is extraordinary. Psychologist Diane Aronsoft suggests that a 1-year-old boy who unsnaps his onesie is making a dress out of it and thereby showing his desire to be a girl. Here, she is shown mimicking a female toddler tearing barrettes from her hair, behavior Aronsoft says can signal that a toddler is a boy trapped in a girl's body. As more and more parents are exposed to people like Aronsoft and inculcated in gender ideology, we will see more and more children led to feel that they were born in the wrong body. Diane Aronsoft's materials are listed as resources in at least 2 of the gender identity books read to school children in Seattle. The school curriculum insists that whatever anybody feels is what is real, regardless of biological reality. Background materials for high school teachers remind them that, quote, teaching your students to distinguish facts from opinions and from feelings is at least as important as any content you will convey, unquote. But the schools aren't teaching children how to distinguish facts from feelings. On the contrary, they are urging students to elevate feelings over fact.
Schools teach children that gender expression is how you express your gender identity, that it's how you choose to present yourself to the world, which clothes you wear, how you style your hair, how you walk and talk. Other definitions presented to children are similar. Children are taught that gender expression is how you express yourself on the outside through things like clothing, mannerism, and hairstyles, and the way you do things. The external appearance of one's gender identity, usually expressed through behavior, clothing, body characteristics, or voice, and which may or may not conform to socially defined behaviors and characteristics typically associated with being either masculine or feminine. The physical manifestation of one's gender identity through clothing, hairstyle, voice, body shape, etc.
Children are instructed to engage in activities, reviewing the gender expressions of characters in books, and exploring their own gender identities and expressions. Here's the chart children fill in 1st and 2nd grade after the reading of A House for Everyone. None of this makes any sense. How can things that have nothing to do with reproductive anatomy somehow affect whether someone is a boy or a girl? How is it logical to say that clothing, mannerisms, hairstyles, running, building with Legos, spelling, convey something about a child's sex? Now look at the details of the chart. Here we have a girl named Ivy who acknowledges that she is a girl. Her gender expression is said to include wearing a t-shirt and shorts. Yet for this child, Tom, a girl who says she's a boy, those same things, shorts and t-shirts, are said to express a boy gender identity. How can something that expresses one sex also express the opposite sex? Presenting contradictions like this to children as if they were rational does them a great disservice. Requiring them to spend time cataloging so-called gender expressions does them an even greater disservice. Gender identity proponents insist that children's explorations of gender identity and expression will free them to be their authentic selves. But having children observe and catalog so-called gender expressions in other people instills in them a belief that they too will be watched and their own activities will be cataloged. Telling them that everything they do conveys something about what sex or gender they are steals from them the joy of just doing things because they want to do those things, without the burden of labels and self-consciousness. It makes sense to help kids recognize and push back against sexist stereotypes. It's appropriate to teach them to be tolerant of gender non-conforming classmates, but sending them on a quest for gender identities and teaching them to evaluate their and others' actions as gender expressions undermines authenticity. Let's look at some of the gender identity labels children are urged to choose from. Gender ideology sets up a big divide between those who are said to be cisgender and those who are said to be transgender and non-binary. What do these terms mean? Typical definitions revolve around whether a person's gender identity matches or aligns with their biological sex. Matching or aligning could simply refer to whether a person believes themselves to be the sex consistent with their biology. But it could also refer to whether a person's behaviors and preferences match those considered appropriate for their sex, based on sexist stereotypes.
Some of the more detailed definitions of trans, cis, and non-binary are clear about it being alignment and non-alignment with sexist stereotypes that determine one's status. The Human Rights Campaign, a group schools rely on heavily, says that transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and/or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. This is opposed to cisgender, a term used to describe people whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned them at birth. This definition strongly implies that gender expressions for so-called cis people match sexist cultural expectations for them. But all sorts of people who are not transgender are decidedly not in tune with stereotypes society tries to impose on them. The assertion that those who accept their biological sex necessarily embrace sexist stereotypes, while those who identify as trans reject such stereotypes, is preposterous. Stonewall, a gender identity organization, says that trans is an umbrella term to describe people whose gender is not the same as, or does not sit comfortably with, the sex they were assigned at birth. This definition leaves all sorts of wiggle room for who gets counted as trans. A second sentence expands that ambiguity. Trans people may describe themselves using one or more of a wide variety of terms, including, for example, cross-dresser. In fact, lots of men who cross-dress do not claim to be transgender, yet the Stonewall definition includes them within the trans umbrella. In short, the gender identity lexicon is murky as to who is included in which category, and of course, the guiding mantra is that whatever any individual says about their identity must be accepted without question. It does not matter if everyone is using different meanings for different words. Making matters even more confusing, people often add "and other gender nonconforming people" after the term transgender, further blurring the boundaries of who's being included. When you examine police records for trans-identifying people murdered in the US, for example, you discover that people labeled as gender nonconforming but not as transgender are included in the count. What does gender nonconforming even mean? Most people defy some of the stereotypical behaviors assigned to their sex. Given this, is there anyone who isn't gender nonconforming to some degree?
The headline in this USA Today article proclaims, "More U.S. teens identify as transgender survey finds." The article refers to a study that looked at students in the 9th and 11th grades, which estimated that nearly 3% were transgender or gender nonconforming, meaning they don't always self-identify as the sex they were assigned at birth. What does this mean? How many of the 3% were transgender and how many were gender nonconforming? How was gender nonconforming defined for this survey? They don't say. Children are encouraged to familiarize themselves with additional terms beyond cis, trans, and non-binary. The definitions for these additional identities are especially vague. Many other words for identities outside the traditional categories of man and woman may be used, such as gender fluid, genderqueer, polygender, bigender, demigender, or agender, says the Trevor Project. These identities, while similar, are not necessarily interchangeable or synonymous. The middle school curriculum explains that the terms people use to describe their identities sometimes change, and not everyone uses the same words or agrees on exactly the same definitions. And the list of gender identities is growing rapidly. In 2016, New York City issued a list of 31 genders. A 2019 BBC video aimed at children claimed there are 100 different genders. But why stop there? After reporting that young people responding to a survey in 2019 referred to more than 100 genders, the Trevor Project argued that there shouldn't be a limit to the number of words you use to describe your experience of your gender. The organization Gender Spectrum urges schools to ask, how are we accounting for the unique gender of every student? If each person has a unique gender, why don't we have over 7.8 billion genders, one for each person on the planet? And indeed, some gender identity advocates speak in those terms. A Guide to Gender argues that 2 options for gender is too few. There are billions of people on this earth. We owe ourselves at least that many choices for how to be a person. The ever-expanding number of gender identities drives home just how misguided the entire gender identity enterprise is. Why not just acknowledge and celebrate that each person has a unique personality, rather than setting children on a wild goose chase to discover their gender identity and slap a label on themselves?
Gender identity ideology is rife with internal inconsistencies and contradictory narratives. Children are taught that gender identity is innate and unchanging, and that it must never be questioned. At the same time, children are told that there are gender-fluid people whose gender changes constantly. And the Trevor Project says that gender identity is a living, growing experience that can change over time. Meanwhile, the existence of very real people who have desisted and detransitioned from trans identities is virtually ignored in school materials. Children are taught that disavowing your physical body is tantamount to being yourself. Halting your body's maturation with puberty blockers, injecting hormones in concentrations meant for a different sex, and even surgically altering or removing healthy body parts are all part of being yourself. This illogical and dangerous sentiment is presented to children over and over again via books like It Feels Good to Be Yourself, and via the resources to which schools refer children. One such resource, the Trevor Project, has this exchange on its website. A young woman says, "I'm not completely comfortable with the body I was born with. In particular, my feminine figure is really getting to me, and I really wish that I had the ability to grow facial hair." She is thinking about cross-sex hormones to help me feel comfortable in my body, and she needs advice. Instead of someone helping this woman overcome her negative body image, the Trevor Project celebrates her self-loathing and chats about the ins and outs of hormones, saying, "It sounds like you have a very good idea of what you're looking for and what you hope to get out of hormone replacement therapy. That's a great first step, because it's really important to understand what could make you feel more like you."
Children are taught that the way to fight sexist stereotypes is to treat them as sacrosanct, changing pronouns rather than denouncing the stereotypes themselves. For an illustration, pause the video and read through these 2 pages in the book They, She, He, Me, which teachers are encouraged to read in 1st or 2nd grade. The basic argument goes like this. You know who you are. Sexist stereotypes imposed on your sex don't fit with who you are. Therefore, tell people not to use the pronoun for your sex. Give them a different pronoun to use. That way, you'll be sharing what you feel inside instead of going along with their sexist view of who you are. Seriously? There is a huge, irrational leap between the 2nd and 3rd points in this argument. How is it fighting gender oppression for a boy to say, "Hey, don't call me he. I like to wear makeup, so I insist you call me something other than he"? Wouldn't it be better to challenge the sexist stereotype itself? A true opponent of gender oppression would say, "Hey, I'm a boy and I like to wear makeup. Boys can wear makeup. Get over it." Schools should be helping children learn how to think rationally and to recognize irrational narratives. Gender identity education does the opposite. By insisting that everyone must affirm a child's belief that they are the opposite sex, schools leave unaddressed the many problems that can trigger such body disassociation. Failing to consider the many reasons children may reject the material reality of their sexed bodies is an abdication of our responsibility to protect children. Here are 3 important examples.
Sexual trauma. Background materials for high school teachers acknowledge that every class has students who have experienced sexual abuse or rape, as well as students who have suffered other traumas related to their sexuality. Dissociating from one's body is a response of some children to this sort of trauma. Homophobia and lack of support for same-sex attracted adolescents. A high percentage of children with gender dysphoria grow to accept their bodies after puberty, and a high percentage of those individuals turn out to be gay or lesbian. Now, however, adolescents experiencing same-sex attraction are bombarded with messages that such feelings could mean they were born in the wrong body. Interviews with high school girls reveal that being a lesbian is lower status than being trans, and lesbians are derided for not realizing they are actually boys. Evidence suggests that the number of students identifying as homosexual is plummeting, while the number identifying as trans is rising. Same-sex-oriented children are not getting the support they need. In fact, gender identity education is undermining them by defining homosexuality as same-gender attraction. This leads to gays and lesbians being tarred as anti-trans bigots for wanting to choose partners based on sex rather than gender self-ID. Sexism and sexist stereotypes. When a boy is told that only girls like the things he likes, what is he to think about his sex? When a girl is told that only boys do the sorts of things she does, what is she to think about her sex? Both children will naturally wonder if they are the other sex because they have interests that have been defined by grown-ups they trust as appropriate only for that sex. It is instructive to look at videos and articles posted by various parents of trans-identifying children. These parents often cite their child's interest in things stereotypically reserved for the opposite sex as the basis for believing their child to be trans. They also describe denying their children access to the toys and clothes they longed for in an attempt to steer the children towards the expected sexist stereotypes. Similarly, a girl beginning to go through puberty may experience lewd comments about her developing body that make her feel uncomfortable and unsafe. This is on top of experiences she may already have had, which were objectifying and demeaning. Attempting to escape all that by imagining oneself to be a boy might seem appealing. Many testimonials from girls who believe themselves to be boys center around the discomfort they felt around puberty and the deep-seated sexism in our society.
Tepid attempts in school curriculum to help children recognize and resist sexist stereotypes are overwhelmed by sexist messages in gender identity materials and in society as a whole. The teddy bear in the kindergarten book turns its bow tie into a hair bow after announcing that he is a she. The appealing little boy in I Am Jazz tells children that he has a girl brain right after telling them he loves pink. Letters sent to elementary school families introduce children to Laverne Cox and Desmond is Amazing, two males who claim to be women and who in that appropriated role exude the most extreme stereotypes of womanhood possible. Laverne Cox is an actor. Desmond is famous for his highly sexualized drag queen performances at age 11. Online tools to figure out your gender steer people towards believing themselves to be a different sex based on sexist stereotypes. My 92% masculine score on one of those tests undoubtedly resulted from my indicating that I am assertive, analytical, willing to take a stand, etc. These are all deemed by society to be masculine traits. The list of sexist stereotypes to which children are exposed on a daily basis goes on and on.
Sexual trauma, homophobia, sexism. Each are serious problems that hurt children. Each can trigger dissociation with one's sexed body. Each should be addressed. But schools forbid considering these as possible reasons for children's trans and non-binary identities. Any child denying their sex must be affirmed, no questions asked. This is happening even though there is no credible evidence of a biological basis for trans identification. Schools lead vulnerable children down a dangerous medicalized path, while other possible causes of their distress are left unaddressed. At the same time, other children and teachers are forced to endure the erasure of sex-based rights, the reinforcement of sexist stereotypes, the erosion of free speech and civil liberties, the mockery made of science, and more. Blind, unquestioning acceptance of gender ideology precludes the atmosphere of open, fact-based discussion that schools should be promoting. It teaches children to bow their heads, repeating faith-based mantras. It promotes a culture of censorship in which heretics who question the emperor's new clothes are punished and the facts they attempt to bring forward are ignored. Gender identity education is poisoning our schools.
A century ago, in the Scopes monkey trial, a school teacher fought for the right to teach science instead of religion in the public schools. Today, we face a similar challenge. Sex denialism is the new creationism. The religion of gender identity has taken over our schools. Ironically, biological sex is a crucial element of the theory of evolution that John Scopes sought to teach. And tragically, the newest wave of science denial is being championed not by the right, but primarily by people and organizations traditionally associated with the left. Students are being denied basic facts about sex and biology. They are being fed inaccurate information based on junk science, and they are being indoctrinated with an internally inconsistent, incoherent ideology. Sex matters. Public education matters. Keeping our schools free of religious indoctrination matters. We must fight back. Those standing up to the madness of gender identity are generally cast as right-wing and bigoted, but that characterization is not correct. Countless people who are challenging gender identity ideology, like the makers of this video, are decidedly left-wing, motivated by a commitment to justice for all. Join with us in the fight to get gender identity education out of our schools. Please share this video and our other videos widely. Contact us about efforts you and others are engaged in on this issue. Check out and support groups like Women's Human Rights Campaign, LGB Alliance, and Women's Liberation Front, WOLF, using links provided in the description.